Well, good afternoon. Welcome to our brown bag program today on the evolution and use of wood cook stoves. I'm curious, how many of you grew up with or had a grandmother that used a wood cook stove? Aha! So lots of memories here. Um, I will ask that you mute your phones, please, and hold your questions until the end of the program. And I want to let you know upcoming programs, Sunday, April 28th at 1:30 p.m. is a program back porch conversation. It's about Knoll and it's going to be with some of the former employees there. You do need to pre-register for that program because there has been a lot of response to it. And I think we only have a limited number of seats available. So if you're interested, I encourage you to register for that on our website or call Joanne here. And then our next brown bag in May will be by Dave Luz, who was the former director here, and he's going to be giving an update on Silesia. So that will be very interesting as well. So, and our speaker today is well known, I think, to many of us in the local historical circles. Bob Wood is on the board of the Goshenhoppen Historians. He gives programs at Studio B, a whole series of historical programs at Goshenhoppen, and we're thankful he does programs here as well. So, Bob.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you for the kind words. That was the question I was going to ask with is how many of you grew up with wood stoves or coal stoves in the kitchen? And a second part is, how many of you still have a wood stove or a coal stove in the kitchen? You do? You do? Oh, cool, as they say. Yeah. Okay. The development of cast iron kitchen stoves. It won't draw, it just smokes. Okay, it won't advance. It just smokes.
I need to know what I'm doing.
Just gonna click this off for a second. There we go. I think it's just because of that.
Oh,
Right.
go on.
Okay, maybe. Back in the day, I used to be a teacher, and when I'd be giving a talk or something like that, I just make it up as I go along. That doesn't go so well anymore. So you're going to be read to. It's either going to be from a paper script or from off the screen. So I keep my notes or my script are up on the screen. So anyway, here we go. In the 16th and 17th centuries, that of course would be the 15 and 1600s, timber-starved Europe looked with longing at the vast American wilderness. In 1584, Queen Elizabeth I, 1584, that's going back there, was assured that America would provide plenty of excellent trees for masts and goodly timber to make good navies. Yeah, England had no tall timber for masts in particular. England and all Europe had been experiencing a steadily worsening timber shortage for centuries. In Germany, they burned everything in those big clay stoves, orchard prunings, grapevine clippings, anything that would burn. And they denuded mountains of vegetation, causing erosion and whatnot. In England, the price of firewood had doubled between 1540 and 1570 and tripled again by the 1630s. All Europe is not able to afford so great fires as New England. A poor servant here may get more wood for fire than many noblemen in England. Here is good living for those who love good fires. That's 1629. Area of virgin forest in 1620. The whole eastern half of the country was covered in virgin forest, massive trees. The original forest that the Europeans complained it was so dark and gloomy and scary and full of wolves and savages. It was also said that a squirrel could travel from the Atlantic Ocean to across the Mississippi without ever setting foot in the ground. And then someone once said, when I was doing a program, well, how did he cross the rivers? And I said, it's a metaphor. It's not really. That's really. But anyway, the point is, it was heavily forested. However, by the late 18th century, there was a severe firewood shortage. That would be like 1780, 1790, around eastern cities and towns. Much of the wood was consumed in countless fireplaces. Plus, the iron industry used charcoal exclusively for smelting iron ore, refining pig iron to wrought iron, and to fuel village blacksmiths' hearths. In Philadelphia, too, numerous brick kilns, all wood-fired, produced millions of bricks. That millions is not a figure of speech, millions. But most trees were simply burned to clear the land. Additionally, burning millions of brick in the 18th century Philadelphia region consumed enormous amounts of wood, as the brick kiln needed to be heated to well over 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit, a white-hot heat, wherein the bricks needed to soak for some time to get them fully vitrified. If they were fully vitrified, they became called red stretchers, and if they weren't fully vitrified, they were the salmon brick that was not durable. So they put the fire brick on the interior of the wall and the red stretchers on the outside of the wall. Sometimes they'd mix them up, as anyone who has a brick house knows. So, enormous amounts of charcoal were consumed by the iron furnaces. Oley furnace in 1783 consumed about 840 bushels every 24 hours, for which about 22 cords of wood were necessary. This took about an acre of woodland a day. This cut woodland was then called sproutland and could be recoaled in about 25 years. Oftentimes, the furnace would have access to a certain amount of wood, like Maybury Furnace in Green Lane. They had about 1,000 acres. And when that was run, they'd run the furnace for 1,000 days and then just go cold and leave and come back in 20 years and start it up again. But the limiting factor in making iron was the charcoal, was the firewood. Iron ore, there was plenty. Limestone, there was plenty. But the charcoal, that was the limiting factor. Anyway, a researcher noted that in the fall of 1748 in Philadelphia, the price of a cord of hickory was 18 shillings. Now, it's useless to talk about money in shillings and pounds and pence. However, use this as a standard. A workman earned about 3 shillings a day. So if a cord of hickory cost 18 shillings, that was 6 days' pay for a working man, or about more or less, say, a week. You had to work a week to buy 1 cord of wood. By the next year, it had climbed to 22 shillings, and after a December cold spell, the price rose to 27 shillings. Despite the rapid inflation, the researcher noted that wood was still so scarce that one had to hurry and take it lest it be snapped up by someone else. A cord of green hickory or oak, those were the preferred woods, weighed about 5,500 pounds, seasoned about 4,000 plus. Firewood was priced according to demand. Hickory, the preferred wood, consistently commanded the highest price, with white oak a close second. I've never seen anything other than prices and so on for hickory and oak. Those were the best. But there were a lot of lesser woods. Birch, beech is good, ash, elm, they're not as good, but you would think they probably burned those too and paid for those, but there's no record of it. Everything was oak and hickory. These were the only two deemed worthy of the name firewood. In Lancaster City in 1763, a cord of hickory cost 15 shillings and oak 10 shillings. Here, much of the cost was for transportation to haul it from the woods to the city, since most nearby woods had been cut by this time. Some 60 years later in Pottstown, the prices were hickory $3.50 per cord and oak $2.50 per cord. Even though the monetary system had changed and inflation had carried the price up over the years, the relative values were still the same as they were in 1763. Both values translate to approximately the same amount of daily labor to buy. It took about 7 days' labor to earn a cord of hickory wood. So says Alan Kaiser from his upcoming book. And there, of course, we have the 5-plate stove. And sometimes when I give this presentation, I will say, well, that stove, where's the door? How do you put the wood in? How do you get the ashes out? Where's the stovepipe? And of course, everyone here would know all about that, or not. If you don't, that stove is built tight against the wall. It's actually built into the wall. There's a hole in the wall, and on the other side is the kitchen fireplace. And that stove is fueled from the kitchen fireplace, and ashes are scraped out into the kitchen fireplace. The advantage is, in the good room of the house, you have this big cast iron heater. They're probably 300 pounds or more. And no smoke, no ashes, no dirt, no dust, just heat. You couldn't beat it. There's a little schematic of how it was set up. You see a kitchen fireplace and a stove, and the smoke went right back up the kitchen chimney. Closed iron stoves used a tiny fraction of the wood, as did an open fireplace. Nevertheless, Anglo culture, that is English culture, refused to adopt stoves, probably because stoves were closely associated with German culture, which largely used them. And to the English, if the Germans are using them, they're not going to. In 1744, Franklin himself worried that the occupants of homes heated by jam stoves, that is the 5-plate stove, were obliged to breathe the same unchanged air mixed with the breath and perspiration from one another's bodies, which is very disagreeable to those who are not accustomed to it. Benjamin Rush's 1806 review of German stoves was more positive than Franklin's, but Rush was not selling stoves. The Germans are great economists of their wood. Hence, they burn it only in stoves in which they consume but a fourth or a fifth part of what is burned in open fireplaces. Their houses are, moreover, rendered so comfortable at all times by large closed stoves that twice the business is done by every member of the family in knitting, spinning, and mending farming utensils than is done in houses where every member of the family crowds near to a common fireplace. In the English houses, it is said, or research shows, that almost every room had a fireplace, and many of them kept those fireplaces going all the time. Now, even burning wet wood, green wood, it took an enormous amount of wood. So they're talking like 40, 20, 25, 30 cords a year. I can't imagine, too, incidentally, in Philadelphia, on a calm, still day, it must have been so smoky you couldn't see from one side of the street to the other. But there were literally hundreds of fireplaces smoldering green wood. So you would think they were, seems that way to me. The earliest jam stoves, that's 5-plate stoves, made in Pennsylvania were cast by 1726 at one of several pioneering iron furnaces. Probably the closest one to here is in Colebrook Dale near Boyertown. Before that, they were cast in Europe and imported. The American stoves have a different hooking together system of the plates, and you can always tell if a stove is American or European, but that's another story. These stoves had motifs and scenes and texts explaining the scene, or floral motif or text giving the furnace and ironmaster's name. Biblical scenes were popular for a decade or so, but the design in the beginning, practically all the stoves had biblical scenes and biblical references. What's the book, the Bible in Iron? about the five-plate stoves. But the design with two arches, tulips, and the furnace name became the design by the end of the jam stove era. Mike Hart found in a demolished house near Boyertown, May 2023. They're all kind of the same. There you have. See if I can get this pointer to work. You have the two arches, the tulip, the heart, the furnace name, and the date. Curious thing that strikes me about a date since put this away. I think I had. No. Here, on almost all dates in the 18th century, this is 1758, 1758. The number one is almost universally has this curly Q on it. It's on text, well, here it's on in iron, but it's on written text. The date, the number one always has that curly Q on it. And no one seems to know why they did that and what it was for. My theory is it's the snake crawling up the tree in the garden. But I don't know. Curiosity. Despite claims to the contrary, some families cooked certain foods on the stub, on the iron stove. Two people recall 3 different cakes that were made on the stove. George Labar remembered cooking directly on the stove. In the 1770s in his home, buckwheat cakes were baked on the iron box in the opposite room from the kitchen. Betsy Schwoyer, an Eastern Berks County woman, remembered 2 cakes. One they baked directly in the stove. Both were part of the flat cake tradition brought from Europe. Anti-stovites. In Anglo culture, there soon developed a widespread anti-stove sentiment on the grounds that heating room air was unhealthy and morally objectionable. In 1776, stoves were removed from Independence Hall as members of the Congress complained that these stoves were affecting their health and eyesight. After visiting the women's dormitory in Bethlehem, John Adams wrote to his wife that the rooms were kept extremely warm by Dutch stoves, and the heat, the want of fresh air, and exercise relaxed the poor girls in such a manner as must, I think, destroy their health. Nancy Shippen of Philadelphia noted in her journal in 1784 that she was much alarmed by mamas being taken suddenly ill in consequence of her sitting too near a stove. Americans worried also about the moral influence of stoves and debated the propriety of installing stoves in public structures identified with their spiritual heritage, churches and meeting houses. I know a story from the early 19th century, around 1810, 1820, there was only one German Reformed theological seminary in the country, and that was in Swamp. The pastor there who ran it, his name escapes me at the moment, but anyway, a student from that theological seminary was preaching his first practice sermon in Limerick at the Limerick Reformed Church, which still stands along 422, old 422 Bridge Pike. Anyway, there's big controversy in that church about putting a stove in the church. So they put in a stove, but no stovepipe, which did not deter them. They started a wood fire going anyway. And he said that between all the coughing and the haze and his eyes smarting, he doesn't know how he got through the sermon. Yeah, that's a true story. Stovepipe. The invention in England just before 1750 of the process of rolling iron into sheets thin enough and large enough to produce stovepipe made the freestanding stove possible and the relocation of the fireplace from the middle of the house to the gable ends. The gable wall is the wall that comes to a point at the top. Due to the availability of stovepipe by the 1770s, 10-plate stoves began to appear with 6 exterior plates and a 4th plate and 4 plates around which the heat and smoke passed. The ovens were small, at first only 6 inches high, 10 inches wide, and 18 inches deep. 10-plate stoves appear to be the forebears of kitchen stoves. First cast in 1765, the firebox was 2 feet deep to accept cordwood cut in half. The local blacksmith made all the little hooks and catches and so on and hinges, and he put the stove together at his shop. He had the plates there, and he assembled it, and they were enormously popular. There were differences in refining the iron and smelting and the iron forges and furnaces. And they made a finer grain iron, and these were cast in flasks, unlike open cast. Instead of pouring the iron out in a puddle in the ground, as it were, these were flask casts where there was a pattern and two halves, foundry sand, and basically the way they do it today, and made a much finer grain and much more detail. They loved them. They were immensely popular. The use of 10-plate stoves would have varied from house to house, but they seem to have replaced the old 5-plate stoves in the living room. 5-plate stoves seem to have more or less disappeared at the end of the 18th century. No reminiscences by old people in the late 19th century carry memories of the 5-plate stoves. Also, we commonly find recycled plates in early 19th century construction. 10-plate stoves were the fashion, and fashion rules the day. So these were the second or third generation of people here. They might build another house or refurnish and refurbish the old house. And these ugly old boxy 10-plate stoves, out they go. And the 5-plate stoves. And the 10-plate stoves were much more beautiful. However, if you put the 10-plate stove in the living room, you have wood and ashes in the living room, in the good room. So I think that the old 5-plate stoves were much better, but as it says, fashion rules the day. And what I find here in the Johannes Markley's day book, he was a blacksmith near Fagleysville. You find these all over, right here. An Offenbeschlagen. Beschlagen means literally to hammer together. And so an oven is a stove. So an Offenbeschlagen meant 19.5 pounds of pipe. 5 pounds, 9 shillings, 9 pence. That's a lot of money. If you remember that 5 pounds, this was Pennsylvania currency, not sterling, but still, it was a workman made 3 shillings a day. A pound is 20 shillings. So he had to work almost a week to get a pound and work a week to get a pound. And this is 5 pounds. So it represents 5 weeks labor for a working man. So, and you'll find about this time, 1794, all over in the book, here, Brooks, 1794, an Offenbeschlagen meant 19 pounds of pipe of roar. And it seems like universally in the 1790s, out went the old boxy 5-plate stoves. And you find the cast iron of the plates was useless to the village blacksmith because it was cast iron. You couldn't do anything else with it, very high carbon. And so they didn't want it and there was nothing to do with it. So they ended up around the farm where they were used as other things. Firebacks in the shanty, in the summer kitchen, uses firebacks, or anywhere you need a nice plate to span an opening. If you're making a bake oven, you have to span the opening where the door is to the bake oven. Often you'll find an iron plate above there. Wood chests from the jam stove period. No wood chests from the jam stove period have ever been found, nor even any mention of them. The earliest recollections of inventories of a wood chest place it in the stove room next to the 10-plate stove. With the introduction of the iron kitchen stove, every kitchen then had a wood chest behind the stove. But in the beginning, wood chests were in the good room. So, whoops. 10-plate stoves presented the basic idea of the cook stove, a firebox and an oven contained in the same iron unit. Fireboxes were commonly 2 feet in depth to accommodate 4-foot-long cordwood cut in half. And there we are. Now here's a picture, a drawing from, that is from 1819, beginning of the 19th century. We have, of course, the 10-plate stove there. It must be the summer because it might not show up too well there, but there's come on. There's holes here where a pipe would have gone in, although usually they were vented over into the chimney. The problem here, there's no chimney here for it, so I don't know. But anyway, 1819, 10-plate stove in the kitchen, an auxiliary, perhaps. That's from Louis Miller's art sketchbook. That's the Lancaster Lutheran Church around this time. It's probably maybe a 6-plate stove or a 10-plate stove, whatever. Here's the village tavern around 1810 or 1820. This fella here on the left is leaning back in his chair with his feet nice and warm, parked on the stove, on the 10-plate stove. Another Louis Miller picture with a 10-plate stove. Few Anglo-Americans were interested in the new technology or in stoves, preferring the sight of the open fire. But in all cases, the cooking hearth still ruled. It must be noted that the radiant energy provided by open fire and hot iron are quite different. In the 1750s in Chester and Delaware counties, stoves are listed in only 2 of 127 estate inventories. Chester and Delaware County, of course, were English. And on the south side of the river, it was English. And on the north side here, well, it was Welsh and mainly German. Yeah. Often called step stoves, early cook stoves developed the design of having a firebox directly under the cooking surface, with the heat then passing around in the attached oven. This one does not look very sturdy. Now, it seems to me that this sliding plate here, here's the fire was in here. Here's the door where you'd put the wood in. And this plate here probably could have been slid aside and the ashes would fall down into a receptacle down underneath the stove. Here's the oven. Here's the stovepipe is hooked in back here. And there we go. Firebox, cooking surface, oven. And that's, of course, in the Goshenhofen Museum. All cook stoves had the same basic design, a firebox to burn the wood with a cooking surface directly above the fire. It was said that no matter what you did, the bottom of whatever you're trying to bake or cook always burned because it has the fire was right underneath it. The smoke and heat is then drawn around an enclosed oven and then up the pipe. This one sits on stove feet. They're called uffabe or stove feet. They raised it. It could be made of wood or ceramic, but it raised the stove a few inches so that the lady of the house didn't have to bend down so much. In the early 19th century, however, the nation faced a growing fuel crisis. The wholesale price of wood doubled between 1800 and 1815. English visitors, Frances Trollope writes, she spent the winter of 1828-29 shivering and shaking near Cincinnati, half ruined, bankrupted in firewood, which is nearly as dear as in Paris and dearer in many parts of the Union. Many observers felt the solution to the problem lay in a new fuel, anthracite coal. One industrialist asked in 1814, how many miserable wretches who shiver over wood fires, which cost them $6 to $8 a cord, could be made more comfortable with coal at half the price. Whether for heating or cooking, anthracite coal must be burned in an enclosed stove on a grate, not on a hearth. Anthracite coal can't be burned in a 10-plate stove. As canals made coal more available in Eastern markets, the price fell dramatically. The cost of anthracite declined 60% between 1815 and 1825 and dropped another 45% during the 1830s. To ease the terrible firewood shortage in Philadelphia is why the Schuylkill Canal was built, starting in Philadelphia and going up to Port Clinton, I guess, up along the river. And that was, I think that opened in 1828. An enormous cost and expense to make that canal. It's not a matter of digging canal, but making the locks and so forth. It was quite an undertaking. And then they enlarged it. And then just about the time they had it really nice and enlarged and going good, the railroad went right aside of it. But then the railroad bought the canal and they kept it running until like 1928 or something like that. It continued to bring coal down on the canal, I understand. The race was on among stove engineers and foundries to have a product to appeal to cooks. That's a revolving top. And well, the top revolves and there you go. Many early 19th century cook stoves were nearly useless. They were often poorly conceived and unstable, like those pictured here, or so intricate and complicated that the average housewife was baffled and annoyed by the nuance of drafts and dampers and boilers and flues. I might mention draft for a minute. If you don't know what draft is, warm air rises. So you have a long run of pipe, often up through the floor and over into the chimney. And that when that pipe is full of warm air, it naturally rises, goes into the chimney, warms the chimney, and that rises some more. And that creates a suction behind it as the warm air goes up. It creates a suction, and the cooler air is sucked in behind it, hence draft. And in your firebox in the stove, the air is drawn in under the fire bed, up through the fire bed, and up the chimney. And controlling the amount of draft is the critical thing with stoves. You have to understand how that works and how your stove works, making draft and eliminating draft. Like usually simply with a coal stove, if you open the lid, the lids on top where you pour the coal in, if you open those lids, the air goes right in, over and up the pipe, and it isn't drawn up through the fire bed, and the stove cools down. It burns less and less and less. If you want it hotter, you do the opposite. You close the lids and open the draft underneath the fire bed, and it speeds it up, and such things. So it was common in the early days too. The stoves were smaller, those step stoves. They'd be in the kitchen in the house over the winter, and then the summer we'd put out into the summer kitchen. They'll call it the shanty. So this is from a piece of fiction. He had got the stove wedged in the entryway door and couldn't get it either way. He had acted awkward with it, and I told him so. Samantha went on tactlessly. Oh, the violence and frenzy of his demeanor as he stood there a-hollering. Make sure no parts are missing. Between 1840 and 1864, 796 patents for stoves and stove attachments were granted. One researcher estimated that at mid-century, 15,000 stoves were manufactured annually in New York and Philadelphia, with another 100,000 manufactured in the rest of the country. By 1850, 230 firms had entered the stove business. Despite or because of the popularity of stoves, popular fiction at mid-century condemned stoves as modern evils and touts the virtues of traditional hearth and bake oven. Dinah set herself resolutely against all cooking stoves. Ranges and inventions of that class declared that no decent meal could ever be cooked by any of these newfangled contrivances. Of course, the stoves were very nice for dozing by. Endless variations. This one had the oven quite separate from the fire. As a matter of fact, it's about 2 feet above the fire. Yeah, a little clipping. The Alhambra or something, cooking and Franklin stove, which may be altered by an easy process in 1 minute from a cooking stove to a handsome open Franklin fireplace. Yeah, I'll bet. But no matter what the style, all stoves required an understanding of draft, that is, the suction created up the pipe. Now here we can obviously see this run of pipe here is too short. You won't get, and it goes over and then up the chimney. It needs more stovepipe. Usually they go up to the second floor. But anyway, it's just a drawing. But so that's draft. Early stoves tended to be fickle. Owners had to know when to add fuel, which often varied in quality, adjust dampers and draft openings, and generally learn that coal was not wood. One lady in 1841, writing to her sister, suddenly whack went the stove, equal to a cannon. She opened the windows to let out the smoke. Just as it was dispersing, bang goes that blamed stove again. She then closed the dampers, at which point the stove chose to puff. In the 1830s, when stoves were becoming more common, many folks were still fearful. The narrator of a 19th century folk song recounts, "The people are wondering when we got the thing to go. They swore 'twould burst and kill us all some 50 years ago." Probably thinking of bursting cannon. I don't know. Overcoming these fears was just the beginning. Once a stove had been delivered, it had to be properly installed. To facilitate draft, it was best to close off the kitchen fireplace, leaving just a hole for the stovepipe. The installer had to be sure that all the joints in the stove and pipe were tight, or the stove would not draw. The next step was to place the stove a sufficient distance from any wall and on a stone, brick, or sheet metal pad. Sorely missed was the cozy charm of the fireplace fire. Consequently, most people, it seems, did not close up the fireplace. There are the old people here in the background. Here's the stovepipe going up, the fireplace here. The fireplace is still open, and they're cooking on there with this open fireplace while the young people are here in the front. The caption on that picture is, "Now or never, 1849. Judging by her reaction, I think it's going to be never. A great variety of stoves just received. Although much early attention was focused on heating stoves, between 1835 and 1839 alone, 102 cook stoves were patented. Note that these below are all variations of the same stove. Even as late as 1874, building and maintaining a coal fire remained a challenge, as described by an article in The Household. Quote, "She began by wadding up paper and laying kindling in the stove's firebox. A blaze springs up encouragingly, accompanied by a noisy crackling, and she noted, but this is succeeded by a faint splutter, which dies away entirely. Dismayed, you take off one of the covers and peep in. The blackness of darkness reigneth. There is no help for it. You must begin anew." Despite the travails depicted in the popular press, by mid-century, cook stoves had become common in the North. 30 of 54 estates probated in Providence, Rhode Island in 1840 and 1845, for example, included cooking stoves. But what was the number in Pennsylvania Dutchdom? I don't know. Probably, I don't know. Probably similar. Post-Civil War, Civil War was 1860 to 1861 to 1865. Post-Civil War, when cook stoves were almost universal, there arose in the press and popular imagination a longing for the cheerful and snug warmth of the old hearth. This was a part of the nostalgia across many disciplines, prompted, it seems, by the industrial age, and a longing for the earlier, innocent, and wholesome lifestyle that people imagined had existed. Here we have the old folks by the kitchen hearth with a tea kettle simmering on the crane, the cats on the floor. Everything was nice. For the kitchen stove, what I didn't go into here is parlor stoves. Along with kitchen stoves, coal parlor stoves evolved. So in the parlor, they got rid of the 10-plate stoves and they put in nice parlor stoves, often enameled and attractive for the living room. And then when the 10-plate stoves were taken out of the house, what to do with them? Well, in that picture there, that's I think it's probably a Fagley picture. Butchering day, find the 10-plate stove parts. The recycled 10-plate stove parts are right here. The base underneath this table are the feet and the base of two 10-plate stoves. There's a piece of fiction. I forget what it is offhand, but there was on the right side pictures a New York City, a city tenement with poverty and a broken down old stove and starvation. And on the left side is the good, honest country fair. And they're in the piece of literature, they're filling a box with good, honest country food, and they donate it to these poor people in the cities that have nothing but a stove to sit by. So at the turn of the century and into the 20th century, kitchen stoves got larger and less ugly, with much of the exterior enameled and chromed, of which there were a multitude. Those are warming boxes above there. And here somewhere in a book, I found the absolute perfect, the model that was in the kitchen when I was a boy on the farm. There is the stove, the old home stove, majestic. There were two burners on top here. Here's where you opened up to put the wood in. My parents never used wood. When they first got the stove, they burned wood, probably green wood. And soon they had a roaring chimney fire going one day. And I think my father said they went up and pulled the pipe apart on the second floor and poured water down the chimney or down the stovepipe. And so after that, they just burned coal. And you'd open the top burners here and you'd pour in the coal. Right here was a little, we push that aside, and it's where you put the riddler in to riddle the grate. And down here, this was the draft. You'd open or close that to increase or diminish the draft. And here was the ash pan. When you'd riddle a stove, this ash pan would be full of ashes, and mother would take it out and put it on the ash dump. Here was the oven with the temperature gauge that never worked. Down here, there were two screws. You took this plate off, and there was a special tool. You'd reach in and you'd clean the soot out. Maybe once a year, the heat, the smoke went down around the oven, up around the back, and up the chimney. So there was soot was accumulated. And there's this tray up here. It was a warming tray, and you would keep the soda crackers up there to keep them nice and crisp. And anything you wanted warmed or kept warm, you could put up there. And I don't know how she did it, but she would engineer full course meals for 8 or 10 people, like Thanksgiving or Christmas or something, all on this stove. And the trick, of course, was to get everything to come out done at the same time. So that was the kitchen stove that we had at home. And then by 1890, this picture was dated, the all-electric kitchen. They look like hot plates. And of course, it's just a drawing, but they're steaming away. It must have been Thomas Edison's direct current by that time. I don't think they had alternating current that early. In any event, so the wave of the future was the electric stoves. And here we are today, and that's my story. So there we are. How many of you have kitchen stories to tell. Good, bad, or indifferent. Any questions? That's my talk. It lasted exactly 45 minutes. I was a school teacher, and all my talks seem to go 45 minutes. It's a standard class length. Yes.
Yeah, I have an unfortunate story. The neighbor who had a stove, the girl who was my age in school, her dress caught on fire.
Yeah.
And she was horribly burned. But I have a question too.
Yeah.
When would they start building houses in this area exclusively for cook stoves without fireplaces?
It varied. Usually, in answer to your question, exclusively, there's no one time and there's no one date. Around, I would say around the Civil War, around 1850, 1860, 1870, in that neighborhood. I think so.
My house, I have a stone farmhouse.
Yes.
But it has no fireplace, never had a fireplace. And it was built for
Kitchen stove.
stoves.
Yeah. Our home was built around, I think around 1830, 1840, and that had a cooking hearth. And soon after that, the cooking hearth was taken out, and a wood stove, a coal stove. So, in answer to your question, the hearth was in a corner in the kitchen, and the big over the hearth was the lintel. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And then the chimney went up and up from there and went up to the middle. At some point, they took the chimney out where the stove was. They put a window to the outside and some closets. And then the cook stove sat out in the middle of the room more. It was reconfigured. It was reconfigured. You can often find fragments. You can tell if you're looking at an old house. You can find clues here and there. Oftentimes, when they reconfigure the chimney, they'd make the chimney smaller, and up in the attic, or usually in the attic, you can see where boards were put in to reduce the size of the chimney opening as they took the cooking hearth out. Things like that. I don't know. There's no one way. They did it when they did it. I know there were people in New Hanover Township cooking on a hearth into the 20th century. Not many, but there's record of it. So, yes.
Yeah, I just wanted to make a comment. So over in Europe, there's a brand called AGA, AGA and AGA. And they were stoves that used the coal, and because especially in Ireland, they had no wood, so they would use peat.
Right.
Peat bombs. And if you watch any show that's done in Britain, you'll see these stoves built into the wall, and they'll have like almost a hearth look to it, and you'll see what like there'll be two round plates on the top. They're called French plates, and they're very similar to the tops of these old stoves, and you lift them up, and that's what you would cook on, and then the oven would be in. Now you can still buy an AGA that is a replica of what they used to be, but now they're fueled by gas and electric.
No.
And there's a brand called Elmira that makes reproduction, those first stoves that you showed in like the early 1900s with the like you had.
Mhm.
You can buy them still today that look just like that, but they're much cheaper.
Mm.
So there's you can still get that look.
Mhm.
But they're fueled by modern.
Right. Yes.
It seems to me that a central hearth and chimney is the most efficient way to heat a house. I'm thinking of the Andy's house.
Yep.
And I'm always baffled, most of the old houses have the chimneys at either end. Then you're heating the outside world.
Yeah.
Why did they want to move?
See, you mean what? They put the English houses tended to have the chimneys on the gable ends. Both gable ends of the house is where the chimneys were. The gable end is where the wall that comes to a point at the top. That's where the chimneys were because they needed that to support the chimney, I would guess. But it was the way they did it. And your question or comment was, why would the Germans get rid of the firewall and the central fireplace thing and put it in the outside?
Just why would anyone want it on the outside? But you explained it if it's a structural thing.
It's a structural thing, and it's the way they did it. The English did it that way. The Germans, in the beginning, you always had the firewall, and the 5-plate stove fed through the kitchen. Those were German houses. The English would never build a house like that. Why? They're German houses. That'd be my thought. I don't know. Yes.
If you look at the older farmhouses, when they had a fireplace.
Yes.
That was like say, inside the house, chimney was inside the house.
Yes.
And the fire was going probably all day and a little bit at night.
Yes.
So then that chimney that's inside the house would get warm and also give off heat to the inside. Later on, when they wanted the space, they put the chimney on the outside of the house. And you can tell on old houses if the fireplace or whatever has been added because the chimney's on the outside of the house. Another thing, when you mentioned about was it your father poured water down?
Yeah, took the pipe apart. That's what he said. He poured water down the pipe.
I think they get a reaction. We inherited a 6-burner stove from my mother-in-law. And she said, when you get it set up, I'll come teach you how to operate it. And I thought, yeah. And she was there for a weekend and showed me how to start it and rake it. And she left. I still didn't fully understand it. And dumped the fire down in the firebox into the ash box many times until I learned you don't open the grate very much. And it's tricky.
It's tricky.
One evening we got a fire going that started to run away. It got hotter and hotter.
You got chimney fire going.
No, it was actually
Oh.
fire.
Okay.
So went over, grabbed the sack of water, moved it up, threw it in.
Yes.
Added dirt, everything.
Yeah. Yeah, it's tricky. And like with a wood stove, the kind of wood makes a big difference. The wetness of the wood makes a big difference. If you get like really dry oak or dry hickory, those really throw heat. Yeah. I had a potbelly stove once downstairs, and I burned the grate right, melted the grate right out of it. Melted the grate. You can do that with a wood fire under certain conditions. Yeah. Any other, yes,
Hi,
Guy,
my parents bought a house in 1961 on TV Road, which is about 2,000.
Yep.
At that time, overhead of her let you move in as long as the house was livable.
Mhm.
They didn't have any, they didn't have any specs. My sister bought a house in Red Hill that had a coal stove. So being Pennsylvania Dutch mother, and the kitchen wasn't done upstairs, they put that coal stove down in the basement, and she cooked off of it. And I would say about a good year, and because my father built the house, it took long, it took forever. But she cooked on it and she loved doing that. And until our kitchen was done upstairs and we would eat there. I did live with her, but it worked. It
Mhm.
positively worked.
Yeah.
Okay.
It was a learned skill. I think a little girl would, at her mother's knee, as it were, all the time that she would learn these household skills at the time. She would learn how to manage the stove and work the fire and cook and so on.
Oh, I remember my mommy had one on Jefferson Street, East Springfield. you know,
Yeah.
when I was, well, I'm almost 88, so what can I say?
Yeah.
That was 80 years ago. I
Yeah.
found and-
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, we can do that. She wants to check for Zoom questions. Any other comments, thoughts, comments? Yes, sir.
For parents, what, a fellow would focus on stick burner stove when they were married. Not, and he had heard have now. His said that the food tasted better.
Yeah, I think it does.
Like, on the other door, there was a dial, and it did work. But she said that when her mother was cooking or baking, she would stick her arm in
Yeah.
the stove, and she could tell if it was ready.
Sure.
to Cake, whatever, and didn't really depend on the
And-
dial.
The one at our store was broken and it didn't matter. I mean, you just knew. Yes, sir.
My grandmother in the summer used to burn corn cobs.
Yeah. And yeah, because you often have,
Went out quick.
yeah, that's right. Nice, quick fire, better for kindling, I guess. Yeah. Well, that's my story. Thank you all for coming. Really nice.
Oops. I guess I have to exit.
Yep, just adding up top, the red. Yep.